to Shattering Myths, devoted to the largest segment of society, to those who know that the world's religious, political, economic, and military institutions are corrupt and counterproductive. I am Yahowah. Our number, if you'd like to join us anytime over the next 2 hours, is 877-300-7645. As a reminder, we'll be celebrating Pesach Passover at sundown on Friday, April 3rd. Reuters is reporting that an airstrike in Yemen killed 40 people who had been displaced. The 40 people that the airstrike killed were not combatants. They were civilians. And in this case, it is, as is the case throughout the Islamic world, it is Muslims killing Muslims. The attack apparently targeted nearby Houthi fighters, but killed the displaced civilians instead. What the article didn't say, and what we know to be true, is that the Saudi Arabians used their American aircraft to drop American bombs on these Shia Muslims. Now, do I care who prevails in Yemen, the Shiites or the Sunnis, in this new civil war that has engulfed much of the Islamic world? No. Now, the handwriting's on the wall. The Shia are going to lose. And to a large degree, one of the reasons that the Sunni Mujahideen have been so aggressive is that the more they whip up the civil war frenzy of they're going to kill you if you don't kill them first, is the realization that first, the defense of your family under these false pretenses is going to stir a degree of support, significant support for organizations like the Islamic State. And also, the Islamic State's going to prevail. There's just no question about it. They outnumber and outgun the Sunnis. Now, in this particular situation, what's unique about Yemen is that in Yemen, they had a Sunni government, and they had a glossy yet thin-veneered terrorist organization known as AQAP, Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, which maybe at peak had 200 to 300 members. America killed almost all of them with drones. But there was just enough AQAP presence to keep the Shia militias of the Houthis at bay, since the Yemeni government was unable to do so. And what's interesting, of course, about the United States is it's so fixated on al-Qaeda that it doesn't recognize that the problem is Islam, and Islam comes in two flavors, Shia and Sunni. And the United States had invaded Iraq, giving Iraq to Iran, and it hugely increased the power and influence of Shia Islam, creating this civil war that is raging throughout the Middle East. It's a product of American stupidity. And so with America aiding and abetting the Yemeni military to target the handful of members of what really was an online tabloid of the Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, because they chose the Al-Qaeda name, not because they were actually associated with Al-Qaeda, they weren't, that they changed the balance of power. And by changing the balance of power, the Houthis were able to prevail because there was no one to stop them. And then when they prevailed and there was another country tilting towards Shia Islam, well, all hell broke loose, and the Saudi Arabians decided, well, we'll go and bomb them. And the Egyptian says, well, we'll join them. What is also interesting in Yemen is that with America so fixated on AQAP, that there has been a steady influx of Islamic State Mujahideen. As a matter of fact, the most deadly mosque killing that occurred last week of the Shia mosque, which prompted the Saudi Arabians to bomb and kill these 40 people, these civilians, the Shia civilians, in a tit-for-tat that only Islam understands, only a Muslim could think was justified. That was perpetrated not by AQLP, but by the Islamic State. As a matter of fact, in Yemen, they don't get along at all. In Yemen, AQLP denounces the Islamic State. In fact, they said, no, we didn't do the mosque bombing. We don't bomb mosques. The Islamic State says, absolutely, we bombed the mosque. It was a Shia mosque. They're infidels. We killed them. So what? And so this, the old notion that Islamic terrorism was inspired by the organization called al-Qaeda has been completely upended. Al-Qaeda is now on the run. Al-Qaeda never was a significant factor in Islamic terrorism anywhere in the world, and now they are irrelevant. And so now that you can't point the finger at Al-Qaeda, and since now the Islamic State is by far, overwhelmingly the most popular Islamic terrorist organization in the world, and is actually functioning as a state, and is growing in tidal wave proportions, that leaves the Obama-nator to declare that the Islamic State isn't Islamic. Otherwise, there's no way to disassociate Islam from the terrible acts the religion inspires. Hello, Glenn. We have quite a mess going on, not only in Yemen, but throughout the Islamic world.
Yes, it's fascinating to watch, but I would suggest that we already know that there will be, like, a great Hegelian synthesis of Islam over the coming years. This is all going to rise to a crescendo with all these factions and fragmented organizations, but that nothing brings disparate groups together like a common enemy.
Right.
And we know what's going to happen. This is all going to build and continue and worsen, and Muslims will continue killing Muslims until they finally band together to kill someone else, which will be Israel. And we know that Persia will be included in that at that time. Iran will be included.
The questions then are few, and the answers are many. We know that the sectarian civil war between Sunni and Shia Muslims is going to continue in Iraq, and it's going to continue in Syria, and it will continue until the last stronghold of Shia Islam in Syria is destroyed, Damascus. And that is the triggering point for dividing Israel in two, which is then the triggering point for the climax of World War III, which is the flood of Mujahideen into Israel. So we know those things are the case. So that being so, and recognizing that with the fall of Damascus, you have a bitter blow to Shia Islam, which is already outgunned, 8 or 4 to 1. Outgunned more than 25 to 1, outmanned 4 to 1. The only questions are, will Sunni Muslims neuter the influence of Shia Islam to the point that Muslims all unite under the Sunni banner? Or will Shia Muslims, as this escalates, defect? Or will they simply say, for a while, let's just stop killing each other and let's go kill Israelis for a while?
I think, well, first of all, I think historically and doctrinally, Shias are already the smaller faction. And historically and doctrinally, it's less viable. It's not, Sunni Islam isn't clinging to any delusional ideas about who their leaders should be. It's just sort of a meritocracy type notion, or strongman type thing. But, I think it's likely that the Sunnis will win. And since we know that Iran is involved Magog battle. So,
the issues, though, are still interesting in that while Iran has the delusional mythology of the 12th Imam and the Mahdi rising to power and leading them, well, they are delusional in that regard. Sunni Islam is far from settling on a leader. Now, fundamentalist Muslims have settled on their leader. It's Ibrahim Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He is the leader of Sunni jihadists worldwide. But you've got some very powerful, militarily anyway, and from a wealth point of view, individuals like Erdogan in Turkey, like Sisi in Egypt, and like the Saud family in Saudi Arabia. And, of course, the gun merchant of the world, they're in Qatar. And they're not going to acquiesce control to Baghdadi.
I believe, isn't there also some question as to what becomes of Saudi Arabia and the oil emirates and stuff like that?
Yeah, the prophecies on Saudi Arabia is that there's very little indication that they play a major role in the war, but they do play enough of a role in the war that their oil fields are torched.
Right, exactly. And that could even happen at the time of Damascus, the destruction of Damascus, and the internecine rivalries of all that. But,
it's hard to know, but
so it could become so disheveled and such a mess that the Sunni Shia distinction could actually fall by the wayside. As they come to, with all of this destruction, that they all just come together en masse, under, in the name of screaming Allahu Akbar, without thinking much about the Shia Sunni thing.
Yeah, what we know for certain is what happens in 10 years. We know the culmination of all of this, which is the destruction of Greater Syria, of Damascus as a city, and the dissection of Israel into an undefensible nation, thinned at its waist, and then an avalanche of Muslims, jihadists, into Israel. When we say what we know, all we're doing is conveying to you what we have read that Yahowah has foretold. And he foretold that the fall of Damascus and Greater Syria would lead to the thinning of Israel at the waist, forcing Israel to give up the West Bank in addition to Gaza, making a country of between 5 and 10 miles wide where 70% of this population reside. And that in turn will immediately begin a world war where Muslims will flood into Israel at a greater rate than Israel has bullets to stop them. Those things we know. And so when we look at the fighting in Syria, we say, well, that's exactly what Yahowah predicted, and it's occurring at the time that he predicted. And what's also interesting, Glenn, is that that is all from the 17th chapter of Yahshua, Isaiah, which, by the way, has an important meaning. Salvation is from Yahowah. The 18th chapter begins with woe, and it begins with woe to a nation that is clearly the United States of America.
Right.
And it describes the United States' malfeasance in this world, where we started the war through our stupid invasion of Iraq, and we're arming both sides and just making a mess of things, and we really have become Israel's principal belligerent, particularly now with the rise of the abominator. And so we play a very significant role, albeit all negative. That's a lot of foreknowledge to frame this issue.
I love it the way Christians often say, why isn't America in prophecy but dispensationalist? It's like, it's in there, but you're not going to like the way it's in there.
Yeah, when it begins with woe, that's not good.
Well, and it also explains...
But Glenn, that's in that Old Testament, and Christians only lug it around to keep their New Testament from...
Well, yeah, exactly. The reason we know this is that we're literate. We can read, and when you read Yahowah's prophets, this stuff becomes all too obvious. But it also explains why the Tarshish and the young lions thereof are so neutered, at the time of the Magog battle. It's like, oh, are you coming to take the spoil? Yeah, they're just sitting on the sidelines because they've already experienced the woe thing, and they're, greatly diminished their influence and power.
Right. Oh, there's no question about it. And almost everything we're doing is leading towards this climax. I don't know if you noticed or saw it in the news today, but the Islamic State, which the Abominator says is not Islamic and not a state, is acting very much like a state. It just photographed its graduating class of mujahideen. And in this, they show, first of all, they're all dressed in black, which is perfect color for them. So they're all dressed in black, and rather than diplomas, they're all carrying AK-47s. And they're clearly demonstrating that unlike any Islamic terrorist organization that has come before, the Islamic State is actually operating as a state. They're providing religious indoctrination. States do that. They're providing training for their military. States do that. They actually have a military. States do that. They have their finance ministers. They have oil production as and trade as their principal form of revenue, although they do use kidnapping for ransom as another. They have done a better job at supplying electricity to cities, putting food on the shelves in markets than their predecessors. They actually control and manage territory.
Right. They typically have real estate with borders, fixed borders.
Well, the Islamic State, I don't think, is much interested in borders beyond where they currently reside. Now, last week, they did advance against Homs in Aleppo. And that's pretty much the furthest you're going to see them want to go west, unless it is to interject into Lebanon for the purpose of keeping the Hezbollah, Allah's party, in a defensive mode there, and not entering the Syrian conflict. They really have no interest in taking down Damascus at this time, because there's just not enough people in the city of Damascus that would embrace them. And they have no interest in Baghdad apart from keeping Baghdad encircled, because there's way too many Shias there. So the Islamic State really has the territories now that they wanted. And so when the media says, their growth has been thwarted, they're just not recognizing they've captured the territory that they wanted. They're now just about defending it and running it.
They function like a multinational corporation.
They do, in a lot of ways, but dishonest. According to the experts, quote unquote, there are two messages being sent by the Islamic State, besides the obvious shock factor of seeing a graduation where the graduate is handed an AK-47 instead of a diploma. And first, that these graduates have received training in this article says, ideology and weaponry. Ideology. I wonder what the ideology is. Is that the Islamic State is functioning as a legitimate caliphate and is a legitimate state. And I talked about this briefly at the beginning of the last segment, at the end of the last segment. We should not be surprised that the Islamic State is simply holding on to their gains and not advancing within Syria and Iraq. They control all of the areas which are principally Sunni. They're never going to control a Shia area. They're happy to obliterate Shias, but they're not going to hold control of a Shia area. It's impossible. So they are where they expect to be there. The growth of the Islamic State is outside of Syria and Iraq. It's in Egypt, and Libya, and Tunisia. in Nigeria, and Chad, and Algeria, and Yemen. That's where the Islamic State is growing. And that statement that I made the day that the Abominator declared war on the Islamic State, and where all the lawmakers and the Abominator were saying that we're doing this because we're going to stop them and actually obliterate them. I said, mark my words. Rather than causing the Islamic states to decline by the United States declaring war on them, they will rise in popularity, they will rise in influence, they will rise in capability. They will become the single most successful Islamic terrorist organization in history. Well, that prediction is looking pretty stout, isn't it?
Well, if the United States can't control places where it has had built huge infrastructure like the Green Zone in Iraq, or had a presence on the ground like Afghanistan, what in the world? This is sort of the reverse of the early 20th century, when Billy Mitchell had to prove the validity of air power by sinking a ship with a bomb from a plane. Now it's shifted to the other extreme, where they think that they can do things with air power that can only be done with boots on the ground and an ideologically, compliant populace. So this is just insanity.
Was it Billy Mitchell that partnered with Robert McNamara in the middle of World War II in the Pacific to come up with the strategy of firebombing Japanese cities to make war untenable for the Japanese? Was that Billy Mitchell? And I know it was a Mitchell. I don't know if it was Billy Mitchell. But it was one of the interesting quotes. Of course, McNamara became Secretary of Defense and the architect of the blunder of Vietnam. But both of them have said in writing that had America lost that war, both of them would have been tried and convicted as war criminals because they perpetrated so many terrorist acts.
It's entirely possible. But all I know really Billy Mitchell was his involvement with validating air power back more, closer to the time of World War I. I don't know his whole career. So
yeah, it might have been a different Mitchell, but that was a time when the United States was the leading terrorist country in the world. It's how we fought, principally how we fought both Germany and Japan was, we did engage both of them in traditional military attacks. For the most part, we prevailed because we were terrorists.
Well, it's like the U.S. sort of loses sight of a holistic picture. They love to have pork barrel politics and sell weapons and weapon systems and stuff. But in terms of the way they wage war, we're always losing sight of things like preparation and a holistic, view, in spite of all the think tanks. I mean, look at the movie Top Gun, where they talk about the overemphasis shifting to missiles, and then they had to learn how to dogfight again and go back to using, to getting in close and dogfight. We're always emphasizing one thing to the exclusion of the other, and especially when you do this, we're going to use air power. You're not going to change the picture on the ground, the complexion on the ground.
The problem with the United States is we have a larger military and spy mechanism, the rest of the world combined, and yet we don't have an enemy that it can be deployed and achieve any success against. The military that we have would be perfect if the Russians and Chinese were to form an alliance and decide that they collectively would like to take on the United States in air and sea battles. We'd be perfect. We're perfectly suited to take on the Chinese and the Russians in a series of air and sea battles. Except that the Russians have no interest in doing it. It's not in their national interest to do so. And the Chinese already own America and is their largest trading partner. They're not going to do it. And so there is a 0% chance that the military, the way it's conceived, has any value. It's counterproductive against Islamic terrorism.
Oh, right. And absolutely. And just in terms of sheer numbers, and it's all about like this transmitting this ideology person to person. It kind of reminds me of these militant male Muslims, all these internecting rivalries and factions, or or al-Nusra being subsumed into ISIS, or it's like a bunch of frat party rushies. So join our fraternity. No, join. It doesn't matter. These factions are all going to drawn together at some point. 1 minute you're an al-Nusra, the next minute you've been, your company's been bought out in a merger with ISIS.
Yeah. Well, look at even, as you mentioned, al-Nusra, which was the dominant factor in Syria against Assad, and then became a foe of the Islamic State, and has since formed an alliance with the Islamic State. And here recently, where we credited al-Nusra for a very successful attack in northwestern Syria, which is where they're the most present at this point. The fact is that the ground had already been prepared for them by the Islamic State, because 2 weeks prior to that, the Islamic State successfully invaded northwest Syria. So the names of all of the different factions are essentially irrelevant. The only thing that's relevant is the Islam part of it.
Right, exactly, and that's how it's all going to glom together over the long term. You want to chase your tail all the time by thinking al-Nusra does stuff, I did that, blah, blah, blah. It's all glomming together under the heading of Islam.
But keep in mind, the long term now is only 12 years.
Right,
over the next 12 years, all of this will be played out. And 12 to 13 years from now, half of the world's population will be gone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how this is going to play out.
I have the darndest time getting people to pay any attention to this.
Oh, I know. We're so close to these events that Yahowah predicted, and he is absolutely precisely accurate. And the timeline is nigh. We are just now 11 years from the beginning of the tribulation. It begins with right after the fall of Damascus, the severing of Israel at the waist, and the avalanche of Muslims into Israel, and the wholesale application of this war. And the war leads to half the world's population dying. I mean, it's 12 to 13 years. That's the amount of time, maybe 14 years, for all of that to play out. We lost Glenn there, the technological snafu. But it's amazing that so few people want to pay attention to this. But that is the reality of where we are. I guess if this had been written by Paul, Christians would be paying attention. But Paul didn't get any prophecies right, so they just aren't. Yesterday I mentioned that a blogger was hacked to death in Bangladesh. This blogger, member of the media, was hacked to death. According to those who were wielding the meat cleavers, literally meat cleavers, that's how these Muslims responded to this man, whose offense was he wrote words. Now, his offense was he didn't kill a Muslim, he didn't rape a Muslim, he didn't rob a Muslim. He pointed out the stupidity of Islam. And for doing that, two Muslims picked up meat cleavers. These were not just radicalized Muslims. No, they were religious students at a Bangladesh Islamic university. They picked up meat cleavers and they hacked the man to death. They said that the reason that they hacked Mr. Rahman to death was because of his anti-Islamic writing. You know, there are lots of people who write things I don't like. Lots of people. Most people write things that I don't like. You know, we read stories in the media all the time about the idiocy of what people are writing. And they're writing things that are just absolutely untrue. And, you know, I've never had the inclination, ever, to want to harm the writer, much less to pick up a meat cleaver and hack the writer to death. That's a special evil that is Islam. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was interviewed on a U.S. Media outlet this past weekend. And he was asked about the Islamic State. And he said, the commentator says, the United States now has declared war on your enemy, the Islamic State. So why don't you give us an assessment from the in-country as to how the United States is prevailing against the Islamic State. Mightiest military on earth against a group that the abominator said is neither Islamic nor a state. I mean, months into the campaign and billions of dollars spent with the mightiest military on earth, you would expect them to have been annihilated, right? Well, President Bashar al-Assad, in an interview regarding the Islamic State, says that they've seized swaths of territory in Syria and Iraq, and they've been gaining recruits since the U.S. airstrikes against the group. He said that the rebels, since the time that America declared war on them, have been recruiting, on average, more than 1,000 recruits a month in Syria. Yeah, we're really doing a great job to thwart them. With every bomb, we manufacture more of them. Now, here's Assad's statements. He said, in general, if you want to talk in terms of the Islamic State has expanded since the beginning of the American airstrikes. Thank you, Mr. Assad, for affirming what I predicted. And Iraq, they are expanding not just in Iraq, they're expanding in Libya and throughout the Middle East. And many other organizations have recently announced their allegiance to the Islamic State. So, yeah.
Well, the U.S. is helping them with the airstrikes, Yahowah.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Of course, the abominator wanted Assad to resign, to leave power, which was delusional. I mean, there's a 0% chance that Assad is going to resign. He doesn't have any place he can go. I mean, so there was a 0% chance that Assad was going to resign. And that's what the abominator claimed that he wanted. And what it ended up doing is inspiring the American-backed Mujahideen to start this war. And then as they became more and more ruthless and more successful, we started bombing them. And we're actually bombing we claim we're bombing on behalf of Assad. But the fact is,
well, then why are we bombing their infrastructure? We're bombing their Syrian infrastructure, which is going to make life miserable in Syria and possibly foment an overthrow.
We took Iraq back to the Stone Age. The bottom line is we did. If you look at the key elements of Iraq production, like electricity and their infrastructure to extract human waste from cities and supply fresh water, and their ability to produce food for their people. And you can measure all of those things, World Factbook, you can measure them, and they're growing, and Iraq is actually a very viable country until the American invasion. And
they had a brand spanking new phone system installed by the Chinese, and we just blew all their telecommunications.
We blew it up. We blew up the electrical infrastructure. We blew up everything. I mean, we blew Iraq back to the Stone Age, and it's what we do. We are
part of making a world
careless.
state for democracy. It's all part of making a world state. Yahowah, as much as I would like to not to have been cut off by the cubicle dwellers, I'm afraid it was just my cell phone dying. But sorry about that. I did want to say.
Yeah. Go ahead. Well, I was going to say, did you hear about Boehner yesterday? What he had to say? He said, I think the animosity exhibited by our administration, that would be the abominator, towards the Prime Minister of Israel is reprehensible. That's a pretty strong word. Reprehensible.
Mm-hmm.
Animosity by the President of the United States towards the elected leader of Israel is reprehensible.
I might agree, but I also have to disagree with most of what Congress does, including this. I mean, they did thwart standard operating diplomatic procedure, and they may even have been like, and the House of Representatives recently called for regime change in Russia. they're involving themselves too much directly in foreign policy. That's not the function of the House of Representatives.
Yeah, but even the Senate, bipartisan Senate, I mean, across the board, the leadership of the Senate wrote a letter, signed a letter saying that the Iranian negotiations are counterproductive at this point, that we should not continue.
Yeah, and they can fold that opinion and prosecute that within our system, but they may have been in violation of the Logan Act by issuing that letter. You know,
yeah, but the fact of the matter is that any agreement between the President of the United States and any other country is not valid until it's approved by the Senate, and the Senate's not going to approve this one.
Right, and it's perfectly within their purview to call that to the attention of the President, but not to leaders of foreign nations. And so I think they're off the radar.
Yeah, I think you really have a problem, because the Obamanator has started World War III. He has disrupted the world to the point that we are in a Islamic civil war in Iraq and Syria, that Boko Haram has run amok throughout northern Africa, that Libya is...
So the congressional option is to impeach. It's not to break the law in order to involve themselves in foreign policy. If they feel that way, let them impeach him. That's their option.
Yeah. Oh, I would certainly uphold an impeachment. The problem of that, of course, is that by trying to hold Obama accountable, it's the Republicans who are doing it, and the Republicans are really no better. So, you know, here's the Republicans trying to increase the size of the U.S. military in the current budget. So they're no better than the Democrats, unfortunately. But the Obamanator is a special kind of evil. He has really put the world at the brink of destruction. We'll be back after the news and commercial break.